It's I don't know. I don't know what your week's been like, but it's been a week for me, for us. Not necessarily bad, just full and busy, and I think that's just generally how weeks go for most of us. But I'm kind of catching up with myself a little bit here this morning. But you guys know how. You know, movies, and actually not just movies these days, but a lot of just like TV shows and all that, they come with, kind of a heads up about, the ensuing content, like, for mature audiences only or something like that. And I have a heads up for you today, and the heads up is simply this. This is somewhat of a heavy subject. It's not like graphic or anything, but just kind of heavy. And so I thought I'd just let you know right out of the gate. Before we go any further with this, let me do a little science experiment here for a moment. All right. See if I can do this. Oh, look at that. How about that? Yes, thank you very much. We'll come back to that, all right? Our series, that is about the extent of my scientific knowledge and experiments, though. But our series is, we've been calling it the even better life, and it's a study of some of Jesus' teaching that's included in what's commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in the first book of the New Testament, the Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew was he was one of Jesus' core followers, one of the 12, and his life was transformed by Jesus, and he became a disciple of Jesus, and he was an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry and miracles and his suffering and death and his resurrection. And he's the author of the first book of the New Testament, the Gospel according to Matthew. And this section in the Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5, 6, and 7 in Matthew's Gospel. And this section, as I've said in the past few weeks, is called the Six Antitheses by biblical scholars, where six times Jesus sets two things and two teachings kind of in antithetical relationship to each other, to an opposing relationship to each other. And he does it by saying, you've heard that it's been said to you. And then he says, but I say to you. And he does that six times through this particular portion in Matthew chapter 5. And he does that not to discard or to disregard what has been said to them before. He's not saying just pay no attention to that, just throw that completely aside. But he does it to bring greater clarity. He points through it and beyond it to its fulfillment, to its truest interpretation of this is what the heart of God is about this issue. And on this particular occasion, he speaks about the issue of divorce. However, as with all the other topics that he's been dealing with, and we've been looking at during these weeks, as with all the other topics, the presenting issue is not really the issue. The presenting issue is not really the primary issue. I mean, it's not unimportant. It's not that Jesus is unconcerned about divorce. Obviously, he wouldn't deal with it if he was unconcerned about it. So it's not that he's unconcerned about divorce. But as with all the other issues he's dealt with, anger, contempt, lust, deceit, and all the other issues, he sees divorce as more of a symptomatic issue. So divorce is not the root, it's the fruit of an even deeper heart issue. And so Jesus talks about divorce, but he uses it, as he does with all the other issues, he uses it as an example, as an illustration to speak to the real issue. And for Jesus, the real issue, here's the real issue. What kind of person will you be? That's the issue. What kind of people will we be? We who call ourselves the people of God. Right? What kind of people will we be? And up in verses 13 through 16 of chapter 5, Jesus says, in essence, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, your vocation, your calling as the people of God is to be, first he uses this metaphor, you're to be the salt of the earth, right? Verse 13, you're to be the salt of the earth. You think about, what does salt do? Well, salt preserves, right? It preserves, so you're to be a life-giving presence in the world, and salt flavors, right? And as the people of God, we're to be a flavoring presence in the world, and salt makes you thirsty, doesn't it? As the people of God, we're to create a thirst for God in the world as people experience the life of God in and through our lives, that people might thirst after him. And Jesus goes on, he uses another metaphor, not just you're the salt of the earth, but he uses another metaphor. It's you are the light of the world, right? And then in verse 16 he says, shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So it's not our light, it's God's light in and through us. And it's not that people might be drawn to us, it's that people might be drawn to him through us. And we're more like the moon than the sun, right? To reflect the light of God in the world. And the way we do that, or the way we be that, to be salt and light is to have the righteousness of Christ, to have the true inner goodness of Christ expressed through our lives, right? That's how we be salt and light in the world. It's to have Christ's righteousness formed in us and expressed through us. And we can't be salt and light all on our own. It has to be a God thing. It has to be a work of God, right? But what we're learning from Jesus is that the pathway, if you will, the pathway to having his true inner goodness formed in us, the pathway is not one of legalistic rule keeping, like some of the religious leaders. He calls out in verse 20 of Matthew chapter 5, he calls out the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, some of these Jewish religious leaders. And he's saying to us that the pathway to this true inner goodness and having God's righteousness formed in us and expressed through us is not through rigid legalistic rule keeping, because this is so important, legalism always seems to wind up in the ditch of arrogance, like I'm really good because I keep all the rules, right? Arrogance, hypocrisy, judgmentalism, and frankly, trying to manipulate God. By the way, by my ability to keep the rules, right? I kind of hold God over a barrel, right? And so Jesus says that's not the pathway. That's not the pathway to having the heart of Christ formed in you and his life expressed through your life. Rather, the pathway to having the true inner goodness of Jesus formed in us is one of humble faith in humble faith in and surrender to the kingship, if you will. We don't know much about kings in our day, right? It's very common in that world, and we don't know that much about it. But it's through humble faith in and surrender to the kingship of Jesus and walking in intimate relationship with Jesus, so that his righteousness in an increasing manner is formed in us, and consequently, as it's formed in us, it's expressed through us as a work of his grace, as a work of God in us and through us. And so Jesus is interested in us not just keeping some rules, but actually becoming the people he intends. That is such a giant difference, guys. We've got to get this. He's not interested in us keeping a list of rules. He's interested in us becoming a kind of people. People with kingdom hearts. People whose hearts are being formed and shaped by the King of heaven. That we would have kingdom hearts. And in these 6 antitheses, Jesus is helping answer the question, what does it look like, IRL, in real life, right? What does it look like in real life to be the people of God? And so Jesus is giving some illustrations, some windows, some examples of just what this looks like in real life. And he starts with, here's what it can look like when you're angry. And we talked about that. And here's what it can look like when you're sexually aroused. And Todd Bowman talked about that. And here's what it can look like in your words. We talked about this last week. As your words express your character, are you a person of genuine integrity? And today the question is, what's this look like in your marriage, or in your divorce? This divorce issue is not a theoretical issue for most of us, is it? I mean, none of these are, right? Anger, lust, deceit, all that. Jesus is not talking in the theoretical realm. He's talking in the real life realm, and this issue is certainly not a theoretical issue for me. Thankfully, I'm not personally divorced. Thankfully, mostly because I married really well, way over my head. And but sadly, divorce is a huge part of my family's story, and some of you know this. But my mom and dad, they couldn't figure it out, mostly because Dad insisted on having, a girlfriend in his life, and my mom and dad, married and divorced each other 3 times, and ultimately my dad married the other woman and was in the midst of a failed marriage when his heart exploded and he died of a heart attack at 54, and so my mom and dad, they couldn't figure it out, and I have 5 siblings, and I'm the youngest of 6. And among the 6 of us, there have been 11 divorces, and a few more really close calls. And then, and many of you know this because you walked with us, through this, but my son and his first wife's marriage tragically ended in divorce. So this is not theory, is what I'm saying. This has been a thing in our family. And it's probably a thing in your family. And it's certainly a thing in our country. I looked at a few statistics the other day. In 2022, a total of 673,989 divorces and annulments occurred across the 45 states that report the statistic. Apparently 5 states failed to report. But and of first marriages, You know, we hear pretty often, like, 50% of all divorces, a first marriages, 43% are dissolved. 60% of second marriages, 73% of third marriages end in divorce. By the way, I just trusted this source, so but I've heard these numbers from other places. I think they're pretty close to accurate. And, the average length of a marriage prior to divorce is 8 years. Couples spend an average of $7,000 to dissolve their union, and believe me, that's just the tip of the iceberg of the cost associated with divorce. Fewer people are remarrying after divorce. In 2008, there were 48.9 remarriages per 1,000 previously married males, and like half that, 25.2 remarriages per 1,000 previously married females. And those numbers fell from 2008, those numbers fell to 32 remarriages per 1,000 males and 17.2 remarriages per 1,000 females. So it's a thing, guys. And truth be known, it was a thing in Jesus' day, which is why he spoke to it, because it was a thing. Look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 31, 32. Jesus says, it's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Now let's stop right there, okay? Where was that said? And why was it said? Well, it was said in the Old Testament, the law of Moses, the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verse 1, and that's where it was said. And it was said because in spite of God's desire, in spite of God's heart, in spite of God's design, divorce had become a reality even in the ancient Jewish culture. And this law, quote unquote, it actually in some ways wasn't really a law. It was but this law in Deuteronomy was, at least at some level, this was a merciful attempt to bring a little bit of order and civility to the chaos of the dissolution of marriage. That's really what was going on here. And perhaps the biggest reason was was providing for the women of divorce. Really, that's kind of what was behind this, at least in some small way. You're probably aware that the status of women in the ancient Israeli world, it's not completely unlike, or it wasn't completely unlike the status of women in some of the Middle Eastern countries, even today, sadly. But basically, the women in the ancient Israeli world, and ladies, I'm just the messenger, okay? So this is not my viewpoint, okay? So, but they were basically property of their fathers first, and then of their husbands. And much of the time, they had very, very little say in the selection of a husband, right? It's like arranged marriages and maybe a little bit of say, in certain instances, but many times not much say. And they had even less say if the husband chose to divorce her. Key words, husband chose to divorce her. Wives, by and large, they had no legal standing, right? They couldn't initiate a divorce. And in the vast majority of cases, they couldn't initiate a divorce. Only husbands could do that. But at least receiving a certificate of divorce was proof for the divorced lady. It was proof of the divorce, which then opened the door of possibility for remarriage, for the wife, because she had a certificate of divorce, right? If anyone would have her, it opened the door of possibility, at least for for remarriage. And otherwise, the divorced woman's life was pretty much doomed to drudgery and difficulty and struggle, as it is many times still in our world. But here's part of what Jesus was addressing, okay? Here's part of what Jesus was addressing. Apparently, there was an ongoing debate happening among the rabbis, and it was kind of divided into two predominant schools of rabbinic thought. There was a school of Shammai, and there was a school of Hillel, and they represented two predominant schools of thought in rabbinic teaching, and basically it was a debate between the conservatives and the liberals. Go figure, right? Who would have ever guessed that, right? But the debate stemmed from the interpretation and application of some certain words that were used in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 1. And here's the verse. Let's look at it together. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. Now, apparently, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I know people who are. I read people who are, and apparently, in the Hebrew language, there are a couple of somewhat vague, maybe somewhat debatable words that are used in this verse. Can you guess which ones they might be? Displeasing and indecent. And the conservative school of thought, the Shammai school of thought, understood this to say, basically, if she fools around on you, divorce her. Or actually, if she doesn't bear you children, you could divorce her as well. But that was the conservative kind of school of thought. But the liberals, the Hillel school, read this to say, if she displeases you in any way, if she's too gripey 1 week a month, or if she burns a toast, if she has bad breath in the morning, if someone more pleasing happens to come along, then obviously she displeases you, and because this other person pleases you, and so you can give her a certificate of divorce and send her out the door, right? Question, which of these two schools of thought do you think was winning the minds and hearts of the men in Israel in that day? Yeah, it was a liberal landslide, and so divorce was prevalent. But here's the thing. If you're just living by the rules, then you can take advantage of any loophole you might find. And as you are taking advantage of whatever loopholes you might find, at the same time, you can feel really smug and self-righteous about it, right? Because look at me, I'm keeping the rules. I'm a stand-up guy. I'm a stand-up girl. I'm keeping the rules. And that's exactly what was happening in Jesus' day, and that's exactly what he was addressing. Just one problem with that. Jesus says, that's not the measure of righteousness. That's not the measure of true inner goodness, the true inner goodness of God. That's not what true inner goodness looks like. That's not how salt and light operate. That's not the heart of God. That's not how a kingdom heart responds. That's not how a kingdom heart thinks. The measure, Jesus is saying, the measure of a kingdom heart is not strategic rule keeping. The measure of a kingdom heart is love. It's love for God and it's love for one another. In this case, it's love for the person that you married. In fact, when this issue comes up again, it does in Matthew's gospel later, chapter 19. We're in chapter 5, and chapter 19, a religious leader comes to Jesus and he asks him, why then did Moses command us to give our wives a certificate of divorce? And Jesus says, whoa, wait a minute. Moses didn't command that. This is not a divine command. This is a divine concession. He didn't command you to give your wife a certificate of divorce. He permitted you. Big difference. Moses didn't command you, Jesus says. He permitted you, and he permitted it because, why? Because your hearts were hard. So back in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, but I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, which means basically, practically speaking, she's already divorced you. So anybody who divorces his wife, unless practically speaking, she's already divorced you, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Those are difficult words, aren't they? So what do we do with all this? Well, first of all, as Jesus followers, and if you're not a Jesus follower, you're off the hook. Doesn't matter what Jesus said. If you are a Jesus follower, you're on the hook. It does matter what he said. And so as Jesus followers, we must pay really close attention to this, and we must take it seriously, because we know that the heart of Jesus, guys, the longer I follow Jesus, the more I believe this with all my heart. The heart of Jesus is to lead us in ways that lead to life. That's what God wants for us. He wants to lead us in ways that lead to life, and not just life for us, but ways that give life to the world. And so we have to take this seriously. Second, do you remember what we've been saying? If you've been here over the past few weeks, and hopefully you remember this. I wouldn't bet my life on it, but hopefully you remember this. We've been saying this over and over and over. Jesus has been saying, we've been saying this about these 6 antitheses. In fact, say it with me. Let's say it aloud together. Here we go. Nope. Is there one before that? Maybe I didn't. I blew it. Okay, so repeat this after me. Jesus is not making new rules. You remember this? Say that. Jesus is not making new rules. He's pointing to a new way. Say that. He's pointing to a new way. One more time. Jesus is not making new rules. He's pointing to a new way. This is so important. That next quote was Dr. N.T. Wright. He says, Jesus is unveiling a whole new way of being human. He's unveiling a whole new way of being human. The way of Jesus is God's intended way of being truly human. In part, that's why Jesus came, to show us what it looks like to be truly human according to God's design. So don't forget this. Don't forget this. This is so important. It's not new rules. Jesus didn't come, and he's not teaching here a set of new rules. He didn't come to make new rules. He came to open up a new way. And that's very, very, very important, and it applies here to this issue as well. Although we're really, really tempted to create a new rule out of this, aren't we? I mean, that's just kind of where our mind goes. That's how we operate. We create a new rule here. I mentioned the passage earlier where this comes up again in Matthew chapter 19, and there Jesus responds to the divorce question. They're really there. They're trying to trick him. They're trying to pull him into their debate, between the schools of thought. And what Jesus does, he says, I'm not gonna choose one side or the other. Actually, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. And so he points them back to the book of Genesis and to God's original design and intent with marriage. And he says, haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become what? One flesh. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And that whole idea, guys, that whole idea of one flesh is a really, really, really important idea. Dallas Willard, I've quoted him a few times through this, but he's just so helpful. Dallas Willard, he said, one flesh is an arrangement in nature. Really important words. It's an arrangement in nature that God has established, and no human act can change that order. It's an arrangement in nature that God has established, and no human act can change that order. Think of the two pictures. The red and the blue become purple. Willard says, perhaps one of the hardest things for the contemporary mind to accept is that life runs in natural cycles that cannot be disrupted without indelible damage to the individuals involved. For example, he says, a child that does not receive proper nutrition in its early years will suffer negative effects for the rest of its life. The deficiency cannot be made up later. A failure of a newborn baby to bond with its mother in its early weeks is thought by many researchers to do irreparable damage. And he says these are representative of a wide range of natural cycles to be found in life. We now know that even the physical structure of the brain will never develop in certain crucial directions unless it does so within a particular period of an individual's life. In the order of nature, he says, some things can never be regained if they are lost. Divorce also powerfully disrupts one of the major natural cycles of human existence, and the individuals involved can never be the same. Whether or not the divorce was, everything considered, justifiable. I'm so glad he added this line. He says, but of course, a brutal marriage is not a good thing either, and we must resist any attempt to classify divorce as a special, irredeemable form of wickedness. It is not. It is sometimes the right thing to do, everything considered. So with these words, Jesus is not absolutely forbidding divorce or remarriage. Although it's interesting if you take these words of Jesus in their context, in their broader context. You look at what's around this in the broader context in Matthew chapter 5. In this context where he's also dealing with anger and contempt and unbridled lust and deceit. And he's saying, God wants to root those things out of your life. And guess what? Guess what would happen to the instances of divorce if you rooted anger and contempt and lust and deceit out of the equation? Wouldn't be very many divorces, would there? It's just not that much left to get divorced about. So if you get rid of those things, as Jesus wants to do, and if you get rid of those things, if you deal with those things, then the issue of divorce basically goes away. However, in our broken world. In some tragic instances, divorce, very sparingly used, winds up being the best bad idea, sadly. And Jesus is absolutely, guys, he's absolutely taking on the idea of easily discarding a wife or a husband and feeling self-righteous about it, as long as you follow the rules, as long as you do it legally, right? That's what Jesus, that's the heart of this. That's what Jesus is really dealing with. And he's saying to these self-righteous religious hypocrites, he's saying the net effect of you discarding your wife is that, in essence, you are making her an adulterer. She was made one with you physically, spiritually. That's what the marriage union is. She was made one with you. And now, Jesus is saying, now you've basically forced her into a position of becoming one with somebody else. Let me quote our friend Dallas Willard once more, and we'll wrap this up, okay? He writes, Jesus he's not absolutely forbidding divorce, but he's making clear what the effects are. In the Jewish society of Jesus' day, as for most times and places in human history, the consequences of divorce were devastating for the woman. Except for some highly unlikely circumstances, her life was simply ruined. No harm, or virtually no harm, was done to the man by contrast, except from time to time a small financial loss or perhaps bitter relationships with the ex-wife's family members. For the woman, he's talking about Jesus' world. For the woman, however, there were only 3 realistic possibilities in Jesus' day. She might find a place in the home of a generous relative, but usually on grudging terms and as little more than a servant. So that's one possibility. She might find a man who would marry her, but always as damaged goods and sustained in a degraded relationship. Or option number 3, she might make a place in the community as a prostitute. Society simply would not support a divorced woman to any degree to allow her to support herself in a decent fashion. These circumstances, he says, explain why Jesus says that to divorce a woman causes her. Our scripture said it makes her. It causes her to commit adultery, and to marry a divorced woman is to commit adultery. To not marry again was a terrible prospect for the woman. It meant in nearly every case to grow old with no children, as well as no social position, but perpetual failure as a human being. But to marry was to live in a degraded sexual relationship for the rest of her life, and precious few husbands would allow her to forget it. As I think about this, I think about the struggle of women. And is anyone hugely surprised? Anyone hugely surprised by the many times the vengeful backlash of the modern feminist movement? Or is anyone hugely surprised why more and more women are opting for other women as their life partners? Believe me, I'm not condoning it, or I'm not saying that's the fix. I'm not saying that's the answer. I see how we got there. It shouldn't be surprising to us. So what in the world do we do with all this? Linda and I love to have people into our home, and it's a great way to get to know people and on a much more personal level, instead of just saying hi, bye, on the way out the door here. We love to have people in and get to know people. But our driveway can be a little bit tricky. We live, about whatever, 100 feet, 150 feet back off the road, and it's a kind of a, but when you come in to our driveway, we kind of live, the road kind of dead ends at our driveway and then takes a hard right, and our driveway immediately takes a left. And on the opposite side of the driveway, there's a huge ditch. And we've had more than one guest through the years when they're coming out of our driveway, not quite make that turn they didn't see over the front and land in that huge ditch. We've had more than one person land in the ditch coming out of our house. And I think Jesus is lovingly warning us about 3 possible deep ditches. Let me throw these at you real quick, all right? First of all, it's the ditch of not taking marriage as seriously as God intended. Deep ditch. And we're basically in that ditch as a culture, right? It's the ditch of making marriage a disposable commodity. Like easy come, easy go. You know, it's just a social contract, no big deal. You know, that whole one flesh thing. You know, this thing is a really, really, really big deal on so many levels, and it cannot be completely undone, even by going through a legal process of divorce, which, you know, if you've been married and divorced, you know that's true. This just simply cannot be completely undone. And we're not condemning anybody. We're just stating the natural truth. And that doesn't mean that there's no life after divorce. It doesn't mean anything like that. It just means it always leaves a mark, and you know that's true. It always leaves a mark. And that's also why God has taught us to save sex for the marriage relationship, because it's a big part of that becoming one thing. It's not the whole thing, but it's a big part of that. And God says, save that for this covenant relationship of marriage. And so that's one ditch, right? Not taking marriage seriously enough. The other ditch on the other side is the ditch of making the, we'll say the victims of divorce, even if there's mutual responsibility in the failed marriage. Many times there is, not always. But the other ditch is making the victims of divorce somehow permanently marked and somehow less than valuable. And we can't do that. That's not anybody's desire. It's not the heart of Jesus. But there's a third ditch. I guess there's a medium. And this, guys, this is the biggest ditch of all in this whole conversation. This is the biggest ditch of all. It's the ditch of self-righteous rule-keeping and spiritual game playing instead of turning to Jesus in humble faith and allowing him to create in us a kingdom heart that expresses itself as salt and light in the world. That's the biggest ditch of all. So what do we do? Brandon, come. Help us out here. Brandon's going to come tell you what you need to do now. So that was news to him. So here, three things. All right. Number one, turn to Jesus. Turn to Jesus. And number two, extend grace to those wounded by divorce. I'm so thankful that the church extended grace to my mom who was so wounded by divorce. That's in part why I'm a follower of Jesus today. Number three, do whatever it takes to pursue and nurture a healthy marriage relationship, including deal with your anger and your contempt and your lust and your lies.